I get why this would weird people out. But as an example, you and I, as human beings in this real world, are currently, and I know this is gauche to say, we are made of meat. And it would be possible to. We are made of meat.
Hello everyone and welcome to Geek Peek. In today's episode we talk with Brennan Mulligan about A Crown of Candy. This is the 5th season of Dimension 20, and in this episode we dive deep into aspects of production, world building and more. Before we head into it, please click the subscribe button because this is the first video in a series of remade interviews about creators, Dimension 20 and more. Without further ado, enjoy the interview.
Okay. So we'll start with an easy question. Before we hop in to talk about season 5, I'm reading from my tablet. Actually, I have it right here with me. Before we hop in to talk about season 5, holy moly, of Dimension 20, there will be people who read this and ask themselves, what is Dimension 20? Care to give them a little overview of the show?
Absolutely. Dimension 20 is a Dungeons & Dragons actual play show produced by College Humor and its streaming platform Dropout that features a group of 7 friends and comedians playing D&D together. It is an anthology series where we go to different worlds and play different characters. Some of those worlds we continue in future seasons. Some we just do one-offs. Occasionally we'll even have little side quests where we get guest players to come in. We've had guest players like Matt Mercer, Erica Ishii, the McElroys, Amy Vorpal, Ifi Wadiwe. And then we have, our core cast is Brian Murphy, Allie Beardsley, Lou Wilson, Emily Axford, Siobhan Thompson, and Zach Oyama. We've had other College Humor alums like Mike Trapp, Rekha Shankar, Jess Ross, Lily Duplay. So we've had an incredible cast of performers, and we do a actual play series with a lot of heart and a lot of humor. That's sort of the tone we try to hit. So, our first season was Fantasy High, which was like, what if John Hughes ran a game of D&D? It's a high school for heroes in kind of an all-American suburb, but orcs, goblins, trolls, dragons, wizards, in the suburbs. Our second season with the full core cast was the Unsleeping City, which is like a hidden magical world inside of real New York City. Our side quests have been kind of like a parody of the bad guys from Lord of the Rings and Escape from the Bloodkeep, and a mashup of Ocean's 11 meets The Borrowers in Tiny Heist. And A Crown of Candy is our season that's about to start premiering on April 8th. And this is kind of, I think, maybe the most ambitious season we've done to date. It is a game of high medieval political intrigue and sinister warfare and plotting. It is Game of Thrones meets Candyland. That is a Crown of Candy.
Okay, we'll get to Game of Thrones in a bit. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Fantasy High was a John Hughes game of D&D, and the Unsleeping City was a modern magical New York City. What is this season's general idea? How did it come to be?
Awesome. So A Crown of Candy started with this general idea of so Dimension 20 is produced by College Humor and Dropout, which is a comedy brand. Dimension 20 is an actual play storytelling show, so we definitely have a backbone of drama and like what we try to create like a plot that is a dramatic, surging, interesting narrative, because the storytelling is going to be so long. It's 30 hours of content. So, even, any comedy is going to need a gripping story to be able to hold your interest that long. But, in the beginnings of Dimension 20, we saw that there were kind of 2 ways to tackle doing D&D comedically. One way is to kind of like do it tongue-in-cheek or glibly and kind of like make fun of D&D while you're playing it, which I think ends up getting really stale really fast, right? The other way to do it is to commit really hard and seriously play an idea that is inherently funny. So our idea when you design the world for Dimension 20 is if you design a world that is comedic inherently, you can make it funny by just committing to it. So a high school for heroes with these teen adventurers who need to like do quests to get a good grade on their finals is like an inherently funny idea, which means that you don't have to work that hard to find jokes. You can just play the truth of the character and it will be funny the more you commit to the character's point of view, right? And for a group of 7 improvisers, it's always going to be an easier way to find comedy than having to like pop the balloon of your own sense of reality all the time. So with the Crown of Candy, you know, when we've done a couple seasons of this, it was just about finding something we were excited to play that would once again create comedic juxtaposition, right? And I think at the time period we were coming up with the Crown of Candy, like the finale of like a Game of Thrones had kind of already happened, and there was, you know, there was like this funny thing where a lot of us had problems with the final season, as I think a lot of people did, and there was an element of, but Game of Thrones also was like this incredible force in pop culture for like 10 years. You know, it like dominated conversations. There were like watch parties at bars, and you know, there's this fun thing of I was looking at Candyland, the board game, and I was thinking about oh, look at this little Candy King and Candy Queen. But whenever you look at history, kings and queens are not like cute little innocent things. If if you are a monarch, there's probably a history of bloodshed and warfare. Nobody gets to wear a crown without either them or their, you know, patrilineal ancestors having done some messed up things to get to that point.
I actually, sorry.
Oh no,
go ahead.
go for it. Go for it.
No, I just wanted to say that I fell into a Wikipedia rabbit hole of going through the English monarchy a few weeks ago, and and
Great
there's
Wikipedia
some,
hole.
there's some really messed up stuff there.
You ain't kidding, man. There's like, yeah, it's really messed up. Those like high European monarchies are, you know, and that's the funny thing is it's this especially as someone who loves history, there's this really wild thing where you go and look at these you know, European nations during that time that were like high, like what we think of as like, you know, Arthurian legend and these medieval paintings of lords and ladies. But then you look at it and it's like the Crusades and just barbarism. It's like this weird thing where I will say this as a matter of opinion for me, a lot of these nations during this medieval period that were like, yeah, and honestly, even in other time periods too, that have been like, we are the height of civilization, are usually accompanied by the most insane barbaric violence of like all time. So you look at kings and queens dressed in their fripperies and finery, and you're like, these are dangerous, scary people. Like, don't get it twisted. So the idea of cute little cupcake people and gumdrop people, you know, these like kings of candy and like sugar princesses and stuff like that, and then doing a Game of Thrones style thing where it's like, no, these are dangerous, scary people, was like, oh my God, that is simultaneously that is like a comedic juxtaposition, but there's also something kind of true about it, which is like the best kind of joke to tell, right? So that's what the inspiration for Crown of Candy was.
That's incredible, and I can't wait to see it. Okay. In every season of Dimension 20 so far, I was inspired by and loved the beautifully crafted characters the team had made. What can we see this time around? What can you tell us about them?
Oh man. So I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, Rick Perry is our production designer. He's our head artist. He has an incredible team of artisans he's been working with for many seasons. Nate Villarreal is our head minis painter. Sabrina Wichner is I think our head set designer. We have Shane Brockway, who's been helping for such a long time. Maxie is a huge help on set. There's like a number of people on the team that are just what happened is like when we did Unsleeping City, Rick and his team did an amazing job bringing this like New York set to life and doing something that felt so real. And then with this one, it was so fun to watch the chains get taken off and go, we are in a candy world made of food where the buildings are food and the people are food. And it was like taking the chains off and letting them off the leash. Like it was an acid trip blowout. Rick and his team were so creative. It was so fun. They just kill. I mean, like it was breathtaking to watch them go so into such overdrive in this fantastical setting. The colors are so vibrant. It's like the work Rick and his team did. Only thing I can compare it to is like when I was a kid watching The Wizard of Oz and she steps out of her house into Munchkin Land, and how hyper surreal and fantastical that is what Rick and his team did. And the second thing I'll say is we have an incredible official character portrait artist this time who also constructed our map, who is Samir Barrett. Samir is, you got to go find him online. I think Sketchmaster Skills is his Instagram or one of his social channels. But Samir Barrett is one of the most talented artists I've ever worked with. Incredible to work with. Such a cool guy, a golden-hearted dude, in addition to being an incredible artist, who we actually discovered through doing fan art of the show. I have a fan art poster of his up in my apartment. That's how we found out about him. And then we were able to reach out and hire him, thankfully, because he does a lot of storyboard work for big animation companies. He does a lot of animation work for big animation companies. So we were lucky to be able to grab him. If you're someone that hires animators and illustrators, boy, should you reach out and hire Samir. He's awesome. And he's done all our portraits for this and nailed the tone and look and emotionality of the characters. Who the actual PC characters are?
Yeah.
Hell yeah. So our PCs this season are the Royal House of Rocks, which are the royal family of Candia. What we want to do with the world building for this one is this is set on a continent called Calorum, which is a giant landmass composed of 6 different food nations that are all based on the American, official food pyramid. This old nutritional public service tool that separated food into grains, meat, vegetables, fruit, dairy, and candy, right? And in our world, Candia is the smallest nation. It is one of 6 nations that are all in this treaty together called the Concord. The loose history of Calorum is about 30 years ago. This thing happened called, I think about 20 years ago in the world of Calorum, this thing happened called the Ravening War, which is this huge war between all the nations that was eventually settled into this thing called the Pax Calorum, which resulted in the Concord, where now all 6 nations are in this treaty where they all agree to be ruled by a concordant emperor who is sort of like, even though they're an emperor, they're almost like appointed or elected as a representative of one of the 6 nations. So there's kind of this uneasy peace between the 6 nations. Candia is the smallest of those nations, but was incredibly powerful due to the brilliance of their military leaders, due to their connection with magic, where Candians kind of have this innate magic to them. They're very powerfully, they have a lot of arcane power. So even though they're small, they are very tough and potent. And we follow their royal family, right? We'll meet them in the first episode. And so working with our intrepid heroes, our wonderful 6 cast members, it was really funny because in season 1, they play a bunch of kids that meet on their first day of school and become best friends. Season 2, they're kind of a bunch of adults that all have their own baggage and are keeping secrets from each other. In this one, they are playing a family and their men at arms. Like there are parent-child relationships and sibling relationships between and like cousin, like even like extended family relationships between PCs in this game, which is so exciting and cool to see played out.
So many things make sense right now in the trailer.
Exactly. It's a really high medieval thing, and we wanted to. It was funny because we this whole idea of like a crown of candy was this very fun thing where one of the early decisions of like, do we want it to be just candy people? And very quickly I was like, no, I want a more politically complex world. So we added in all these other food nations to make the politics of the land really as complex as possible. But we're following this one family from this one nation.
Wow. This is incredible. Okay, so I promised we'll get to Game of Thrones. Okay, I assume Westeros was a bit of an inspiration in the world-building process of this world. The trailer gives off a Game of Thrones vibe, but in a good way. Not like season 8 way. Don't add it. Is that true? What else inspired the world building of Calorum? Okay, so you answered a bit of this. So let me add to this, like if we can expand a bit about the actual monarchy of the world. I mean, in terms of like not just specifically Candia, which is the family you spoke of, like in the general monarchy of Calorum, of this world.
Yes. So the world, I had a ton of fun with the world building for Calorum. A Crown of Candy has the deepest world lore of any of the worlds we've played in thus far. It's certainly the one that was the most, like, I spent the most time being like, what, I need to come up with a couple hundred years of history. We need to come up with languages and religions and royal houses and family mottos and yada, yada, yada. Like a lot of stuff. Obviously, Game of Thrones was a huge inspiration. I think that the things that I did that departed from a Game of Thrones had to do with. And listen, I love a Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin is a genius. I think in Martin's Westeros, religion is something that is definitely present, but a lot of his like priests, like the septons in his world, are kind of like advisors and stuff like that. He has like the Lady in Red, who's really the biggest like religious character. Melisandre, like the biggest like mover and shaker who's religious, which is, I think, a very strange reading of the high medieval period to me, where the Catholic Church was the political institution of medieval Europe, right? So there are a number of different religions present in the world of Calorum, and they have a significant effect on the politics of Calorum. So religion is a big deal. We have a PC who is a chaplain and primogen of the Bulbian Church. So we have somebody who is like an authority, an administrative authority within this large church institution within Calorum. There are parts of A Crown of Candy that, in every season, we all, myself and a lot of our PCs, Allie Beardsley especially, love philosophy and mythology. We love theology and cosmology. So we love to talk about the big questions of the world and how we feel about the world, spirituality, how the world works. That is very present in this season as well. But there's also the presence of religion as a political institution, which has not always been present in the other seasons, right? Other world building stuff I would say is there's a very different political structure to Calorum in terms of supreme authority. Like in Westeros is like King's Landing. There is a king. There is the Iron Throne, and the king or queen sits upon it. In this one, it's resting on this thing called the Concord, which makes everything a lot shakier because there was a voluntary treaty to end this war that all these nations entered into voluntarily. So the emperor of Calorum is attached politically to this treaty rather than someone who is a descendant of someone that conquered everybody. So there's an element to all of this of of uneasiness based on the fact that this is held together not with like a conquering emperor, but with like a treaty, laws, like agreements that were entered into, right? And some of the nations have different, like Candia is a monarchy. Syresia is ruled by a senate. So Syresia is a republic rather than being a monarchy, but is also a part of this six-nation compact. The Meatlands are ruled by this by a high warlord. They're kind of like a more there's the Meatlands are ruled by the warlord of the beef clans. So there's like different structures in the way that these nations self-organize, which I think is also a little bit different from the more formal houses of Westeros.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds. I love how like the world building is so detailed. I
Thank you so much. I appreciate
it. Okay, now I have a question which is a little different, and I think you'll like answering it. So far, Dimension 20 has been a very inclusive show, giving representation to many people from all walks of life. I'm sure this season won't be any different. However, I'm curious about the process. Medieval times weren't as inclusive as the 21st century, and I'm wondering if the team has given some thought on how to tackle this issue.
I do love this question, Oren. Thank you so much. In every season of the past many of Dimension 20 seasons that we've done, we always hire sensitivity consultants to consult on the show in matters of race and ethnicity, in matters of sexual orientation, in matters of disability, all the kind of things that we can do to make the show as inclusive as possible. And we always include consultation from these sensitivity consultants as early in the process as possible. Because the show is improvised at the table, we can't do what like a screenwriter or novelist would do, which would be to submit a manuscript to a sensitivity reader or sensitivity consultant and then get notes back. So we need to be as prepared as possible when we go in to improvise with what we're planning on doing. So the trick with A Crown of Candy was we have nations, we're going into this medieval period that was extremely barbaric. And how do we make it inclusive? There are themes that we want to include that have to do with betrayal, politics, and war. And in those situations, people do use differences of nations and xenophobia to whip up public feeling and animosity between nations. So that's a part of politics, right? What I will say is there were a lot of interesting conversations in making sure that this show cleaved to Dimension 20's desire and love for representation and inclusivity, while also depicting a season that's going to have a lot of bad guys in it, right? One of the things that we decided really quickly was, we always want a show that is really inclusive of race. And this was a very interesting season because we're in a world where everybody is like gumdrops and broccoli, So it's this world where ideas of race are bizarre because there's a character who's the king's right hand man who's just a slice of cake. So what race is that? And we have an awesome artist, Samir Barrett, who, after having a lot of toxic sensitivity consultants, we had these initial conversations with the consultants that had to do with this period of time is kind of based historically on the same thing that Game of Thrones is based on, which is the War of the Roses, these like high medieval conflicts between like England and France and these kind of European nations. Do we want to be inclusive of non-European countries at the risk of engaging in stereotype about other nations? Like if you include a East Asian nation, you get into issues of like, well, what food are those characters made out of? And that can be something that can be very triggering for people and make them feel less included in the show. And what do we do with like, and then if you have these nations that kind of have like national character to them, what is the character you give if you're trying to base a nation on a non-European nation, right? And we had a lot of consultations about it. And basically what a lot of our sensitivity consultants came to was, because you're basing this on a historical period and basing it on this like Dark Ages or high medieval Catholic Church dominated Europe, there were people of color in Europe at that time, right? And that often gets fully erased. There's a lot of great, if you go online, you can find like Medieval POC is an awesome Tumblr about the presence of non-white people in medieval Europe that have been totally erased from history. So the decision we ended up making, and we went and talked to Samir Barrett, was it is going to be okay for us to keep the architecture, the clothing design, keep those things in this like high medieval kind of Candyland-esque, high medieval Bavarian Gothic European place, but we're not going to default our character art to being Eurocentric. So if our people are made of candy and meat and vegetables and fruit, we don't need to default to white features for those characters. We don't need to default that, when the characters are humanoid enough looking and they're not like just an apple with legs and arms or whatever, let's not default to European features for anybody, even though our architecture and military stylings are going to be kind of Eurocentric. So that was like a thing that was a bunch of awesome conversations about how to make the show as inclusive as possible. And then there are some decisions we made about inclusivity where we just looked at like LGBT representation, and we just kind of went like, you know what? We're going to make this world just more inclusive of that. So, there are same-sex relationships just in the world. Different nations have different levels of feeling about those issues, but for the most part, we just said like we want to represent people on the LGBT spectrum, in a more inclusive way than maybe the Middle Ages were at the time. And then, past that, in terms of other types of representation, it's very interesting because there are a lot of villainous forces in this season. So there's definitely some bad eggs out there, but I think the main thing is that our heroes are extremely inclusive. So our PCs and Candia in general are immune to a lot of like forces of bigotry, and so hopefully anyone watching the show will find themselves included, at least in the arms of the heroes of the show.
Awesome. I remember in the trailer I saw a character. I'm so curious about that character, and I gotta ask. There was a character in the trailer who was a bag of chips, and I'm like, wait, can you explain that for a second?
Yeah, 100%. So to answer your question, certain food people in Calorum are born with a part of their body also being a container for the food that they are. So the bag is also a part of that character's body.
Oh God.
There's another character who is a living bottle of milk, and the glass bottle is a part of her body as well. She is a
Wow.
yes, absolutely.
That's great. I'm curious about how the different groups of people live their lives in this world. What is the life experience of someone living in the meat country as opposed to a person living in Vegetania?
Oh, awesome. So the nations are very different from each other. So the meat lands is a land. I think the biggest difference between the meat lands and Vegetania, and I can talk about a lot of the different nations. The meat lands are modeled on like ancient Celts a little bit. So they are, the big struggle in the meat lands is that they have been converted to the Bulbian Church the least. Their primal ancestral faith in the great beasts, which is a polytheistic belief in the great animals that make up meat. Because one of the things about these food people is they don't eat each other, but they do have an understanding that they are all food, even though there's no human beings walking around eating them. So that belief that they are food ends up being a religious conviction. So in the meat lands, this manifests in this belief in like, if you're a prime rib steak or you're a hot dog, you still know that as a religious conviction that you are descended from the great cow or the great pig, even though you've maybe never seen a real cow or a pig before, right? And those So the Meatlanders live in this stark, beautiful land of like bones and like red fields of meat. They are like, a proud, noble people that, like have this belief and love of like, they're kind of like the classic like barbarian nation, right? They have a giant metropolis city called Karn, where Basham Yasa, who's the warlord of the beef clans, lives. They're like the sort of Meatlander vibe is like they don't organize their armies as efficiently. They're kind of like the ancient Celts. So there's like the Romans came in and like divided and conquered, but there's this attitude of like one Meatlander can defeat 100 Saresian soldiers, right? Vegetania is a land that is dominated by the fact that the religious capital of the continent is there. So Greenhold is the capital of King Cabbage, who's the monarch, but Brightgarden is also in Vegetania, which is sort of like the Vatican, right? Brightgarden is the religious center, and it's where the Hierophant Rex of the Bulbian Church reigns and holds sway over the Bulbian Church throughout all the nations of Calorum. So Vegetania is a land where the average day for someone living in the meat lands varies tremendously based on what meat clan you belong to. You could be living in Karn and be a Meatlander scholar or be a Meatlander diplomat, or you could be living out in the fields or living out in the wilds and be a raider or a scavenger, be a farmer, be one of any number of Meatlanders. For someone living in Vegetania, you are probably a serf who is, tilling the fields, unless you are one of the many clergy members that live there, in which case you could be in Brightgarden having an incredibly detailed political life, or one of any number of monks and abbots, cloistered scholars, nuns, etc. And then I'll go into less detail for the others. Fructera is a sort of like almost like Renaissance Italy or like Spain, France. But Fructera is like a lot of wealth, a lot of trade. Fructera is kind of this like fertile, it's like and it's also where Comida, the capital of Calorum, is. Syresia is the most populous land. It's a republic. It's a very kind of like Roman, like imperial vibe, but no emperor anymore. The Dairy Islands are sailors, so they're a very naval focused place that are kind of a smaller nation, honestly. And then Candia is this like extremely small but extremely powerful, kind of rooted in magic, scholarship, wonder. There's like a lot more natural fantasy to Candia than there is to a lot of the other kingdoms, and that can be something of an issue, like in this, because the Meatlanders are kind of like out and out pagans in a lot of way, and the leadership of the Meatlands subscribes to the Bulbian Church, but like maybe in name only. With Candia, they're a lot more devout. They do belong to the Bulbian Church in Candia, although there are people that still practice the old ways there. But the issue with Candia is there's a lot of practicing magic there, and the official church doctrine is that arcane magic is a no-go. So there's a very interesting thing there of like what flies in Candia versus what flies in the rest of the Concord.
Awesome! Wow, I'm already imagining it's going to be incredible. You also teased us about in the fireside chat. You teased us about character death. So I didn't have a question prepared for that here because this was written like in February. But I will ask you how much the stakes were raised in this season.
We were modeling this off of this stark, dangerous, high medieval storytelling. So what was discussed between me and the players prior to the game starting was every season has the possibility of player death. And the only difference this season was in seasons like Fantasy High, I construct challenges to kind of fit this awesome, heroic, high fantasy narrative, which is, every fight is designed to be really challenging, but also to make the PCs look like badasses, because that's the type of story Fantasy High is. A Crown of Candy is a lot darker. And I basically told the PCs, these fights are not designed, not all of them, with fairness in mind. They are designed to be realistic to the challenges you find yourself in based on the choices you make. So it's not that I told them there was like, how do I put this? I walked into this season being aware that this was going to be a very dangerous season. And that doesn't mean that I was going to ever bend or break the rules. I wasn't going to punish PCs, but I basically told them these fights will be designed to really take your choices into account, and they will be designed to reflect the reality of the world of Calorum. These fights are not designed to be like cool set pieces. This is like the enemies or allies you make, the choices you make will result in these fights being realistic to the world and cleaving to the tone of a lot of the source material of this type of storytelling, where like the good guys don't always win. So as a result of that, unlike other seasons, we had secondary characters ready to go because we knew how much more lethal this season had the potential to be.
Okay. I'm like, I can't wait. It's out on Wednesday, right? Wednesday?
This next Wednesday, that's right.
Wednesday can't come soon enough. Okay, if candy and food are now replacing nature aspects like trees and mountains, what do people eat in this world?
This is a great question. I love this. people eat the same things we eat in our. So, for example, because I get why this would weird people out, but as an example, you and I, as human beings in this real world, are currently, and I know this is gauche to say, we are made of meat, and it would be possible to. We are made of meat, and so whenever you've eaten a steak or a hamburger or a piece of chicken in your life, that is eating something that is made of fundamentally the same material as you. So for someone made of candy, all that really happens is when they grow a peppermint tree, little peppermint fruit grow on it, and they pick that peppermint fruit. If they have like a little marshmallow meat, like if they have a little like marshmallow peeps out in a field, they'd take that to the butcher, slaughter it, cut it up. That becomes a little candy steak for them, right? So it's almost the way you think about it is in the different nations, plant material and animal material is made of candy or dairy or meat or vegetable or whatever, but it's still fundamentally, they get their food from the same places. So like, even though you live in a gingerbread house, it would be weird for you to like break off a piece of your own house and eat it, even though it's made of gingerbread. You would probably just go to a gingerbread farm and get some prepared foodstuffs there. Like in Candia, I think the thing they drink most often is cola. That's like the beverage they have the most there. But when you go to Fructera, it's juice, right? So it's this whole that's sort of the vibe is there are still kind of like agreed upon foodstuffs that are just made out of the natural material of those food nations.
Okay, so you basically, if I would give a comparison, you essentially took out protein and replaced it with candy for Candians and vegetables for Vegetarians and.
Absolutely right, and these nations also can eat each other's food stuff. It's just about like what is available in your nation where you're growing it. But like when you go to Kamada, where there's a lot of trade and everything, the feasts are like incredible because they have meat, they have dairy, they have all this stuff. So it's all groovy. But yes, absolutely.
Okay, so that's it. These are my questions for you, Brennan. I did want to say thank you so much. And in the words of Ida Eggfort, I love you and you're my best friend.
I love you too, man. It's great to see you. I'm so happy to talk with you. These questions are awesome. I'm truly, truly so appreciative, homie. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Geek Peek. If you liked it, please give this video a like, as it helps it spread and reach to more people. And if you want to listen to the next one, it's right here. See you there.